Okay, so while I was making the video from last week about how my professor assigned us an overly political Ben Shapiro video for homework, I came across this other conservative content creator by the name of the Paradox Institute, and I think that some of the ideas presented there are even worse than the ones in the Ben Shapiro video. Not because the speaker is overly loud or uses appeals to emotion, but because he presents as calm. And even I would say that most of what he says is correct. Even still, the sections in the video that are problematic give conservative ideas like transphobia credibility, at least on a surface level, when they should have none at all. In today's installment of Twig's Change Project, I will be reviewing a video from the Paradox Institute titled Why Sex Matters, and I will be critiquing the sections of the video that I believe promote dangerous and bigoted ideas that lead to real people taking their own lives, as well as backing up those critiques with genuine research and data to show exactly why those views are problematic. Make sure to sit back, relax, maybe grab a snack if you want, because it's time for me to present to you my most grueling project yet. Why respecting gender identity matters. I will start out this video by once again acknowledging that there are large parts of this guy's video that I actually agree with. I will also acknowledge the fact that in some cases, knowing a person's biological sex is very important, but with the caveat that gender identity must be respected and should be the normal way that people refer to each other in social situations, outside of certain situations, of course, where knowing a person's biological sex might be medically or scientifically necessary. Since this video is broken off into 9 main points, I will only be critiquing the parts that I disagree with. And right now, I will use this time to briefly summarize my thoughts on the points that I do not have a problem with at all. The point about truth is extremely valid because it is important to have your opinions be informed by actual research and data.
Number 1. Truth. Science matters and reality matters. The famous theoretical physicist Richard Feynman once said, "It doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is, it doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong."
The point about reproduction is fine, because it is true that each person can only produce one type of gamete.
Males develop a reproductive system organized around small gametes, sperm, and females develop a reproductive system organized around large gametes, ova. Without this system, Homo sapiens and most other animals would not exist.
However, I would like to say that that point isn't quite as important now because we have like sperm and egg banks where basically anyone can get access to the necessary materials to have a kid. The point about evolution is all fair and good.
Sexual selection pressures produced the dimorphism of male and female bodies, led to the evolution of our brains, and built entire societies. The development of culture, art, and technology are, in part, the result of sexual selection on creativity and intelligence.
And I like how it doesn't necessarily exclude the possibility of sexually selective traits being developed for same-sex relationships or gender non-conforming relationships, as well as heterosexual ones. For medicine, I think this is actually the strongest argument in the entire video for biological sex to stay relevant.
Understanding sex differences is critical for the application and development of safe and effective medical practices. For instance, emergency medicine must identify the sex of the patient for appropriate drug dosages and blood transfusions. Sex-specific diseases such as prostate cancer in males and endometriosis in females require knowledge of the reproductive tract.
And I am not necessarily disagreeing with the claim that biological sex should not be relevant at all, because there are indeed circumstances where someone needs to get surgery on their reproductive parts, or knowing how much of a specific drug to dose is actually important for medical reasons. But also that means that people should be able to discreetly receive medical gender affirming care and feel comfortable in their own bodies. Understanding crime statistics based on sex is also important to some degree, as it is true that over 90% of violent crimes are committed by cisgender men.
The truth is that the overwhelming majority of violent crime, including aggravated assault, robbery, murder, and rape, is committed by males. In the United States, men commit 77% of aggravated assaults, 87% of robberies, 87% of murders, and 98% of rapes.
Lastly, the point about equality is also valid due to the reality that only people who were born biologically female have the ability to carry a child in their uterus. Therefore, the legislation in any specific country that wants to be as egalitarian as possible should include things like paid maternity leave and readily available access to contraception.
We cannot make informed policies if we do not recognize the different reproductive functions of men and women and how such functions impact life choices. For example, only females can become pregnant and carry a child, which heavily impacts life and work choices.
Now that we have the non-problematic stuff out of the way, let's get to the juicy bits about the Paradox Institute promoting potentially transphobic ideas. First, let's talk about everyone's least favorite controversy. Trans women in sports. This guy, apparently his name is Zach, claims that biological men have inherent advantages in sports even after they transition to female, due to factors like increased muscle mass, higher testosterone levels, and better grip strength.
Number 5. Sports. Competitive sports are divided on the basis of sex for a reason. Compared to the average female, the average male has 33% more lower body muscle mass, 40% more upper body muscle mass, and 57% more grip strength. Elimination of biological sex as a criterion for sports marks the end of the female sports category.
Unlike the Ben Shapiro video, though, Zach actually cited his source in the description. Bravo! I didn't have to waste my time trying to look for your source, scouring the internet. However, I didn't even finish reading the abstract of the study before I found a line so problematic that it makes this study entirely irrelevant. The text shown on screen for you guys says, accordingly, the International Olympic Committee, IOC, determined criteria by which a transgender woman may be eligible to compete in the female category, requiring total serum testosterone levels to be suppressed below 10 nanomoles per liter for at least 12 months prior to and during competition. Whether this regulation removes the male performance advantage has not been scrutinized. I repeat, it has not been scrutinized yet, because this study is from 2020. And I found a more recent study. And the recent study that I found states that there is no biological advantage for transgender women over cisgender women among those who regularly compete in sports. According to an article from gendergp.com, a 2024 paper published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine added to increasing evidence that transgender women are not naturally advantaged after transition. The paper, comparing transgender women, cis men, and transgender men who compete in regular competitive sport, found that transgender women had lower body strength and reduced lung capacity than cis women. Bone density was also equivalent. It is also important to note that both the CCES and the British Journal of Sports Medicine note that elite sports policy is swayed more by cultural bias than by science. The CCES warns that transmisogyny, racism, and traditional notions of femininity still dictate who is allowed to compete. This form of discrimination has not only been aimed at trans women, but also cisgender athletes whose bodies don't meet traditional ideas of what a woman should look like. This more recent study is more accurate than the study that Zach uses because it only included people who regularly compete in sports, thus accounting for the impact of regular training and exercise on the bodies of these athletes. Another source, sf.gov, reads that despite these facts, the issue has proven to be an effective scapegoat for politicians, even though many Americans are more directly impacted by issues such as rising costs and lack of affordable housing. This bizarre focus on trans people, who make up approximately 1% of the population, is demonstrated by the fact that as of March 15th, there have already been over 745 anti-trans bills introduced in state legislatures across the country in 2025 alone. This is why the whole trans women in sports controversy is stupid, as the magnitude of the issue, whether positive or negative, is minuscule compared to actual economic issues that plague average Americans today. But no, we have to deal with anti-trans laws while billionaires are getting tax breaks and inventing literal legal ways to steal our money. But oh no, instead we have to focus on who has the right genitals to play in a particular sports category or use the fucking bathroom. Like, hello, what are we doing here? Like, conservatives, y'all need to get like a massive vibe check because these issues are not as big as you think. Speaking of having a weird fascination with people's genitals, let's talk about the trans people bathroom issues. The section of the Paradox Institute's video about safety and privacy for cisgender women uses flawed research and sparse anecdotes to justify scare tactics, to attempt to prove a point that is not grounded in reality. That trans women assaulting cisgender women is a bigger problem than trans women being disproportionately sexually assaulted themselves, as transgender people are over 4 times more likely than cisgender people to experience violent victimization, including rape, sexual assault, and aggravated or simple assault, according to a new study by the Williams Institute at UCLA School of Law. Additionally, results showed that both transgender women and men had higher rates of violent victimization, such as SA, than their cisgender counterparts, but there were no differences between transgender men and women. I bring this up because the source that Zach uses cites higher rates of SA in unisex changing rooms as justification for all restrooms to be divided by biological sex.
Number 7. Safety and privacy. Separating males and females into single-sex public bathrooms, changing rooms, and prisons, where people undress and are vulnerable, increases the safety of females from actions of predatory males, and it retains the privacy and dignity of both sexes. Where such distinctions between male and female spaces are violated, injustice follows. For example, in UK swimming pool and sports center changing rooms, from 2017 to 2018, 90% of reported sexual assaults, harassment, and voyeurism happened in unisex facilities.
However, I am not here to argue that unisex changing rooms are a good thing, because it is true that having women of all kinds undress in a space where cisgender men are also present is a safety concern. And I would say that I am against unisex changing rooms for the most part. There is a reason that gender-neutral restrooms are almost always one-person capacity, and that changing rooms are divided into gender binaries, not sex binaries. Which, by the way, those signs on the door would not stop a cis man with bad intentions from entering a woman's restroom and committing some kind of violent crime. And if you want some anecdotes sprinkled on top, there have been multiple cases of cis women who don't look like stereotypical women being harassed for using the restroom by either security guards or by staff in public places. Knowing these problems are of a far greater magnitude than the extremely rare cases of a trans woman entering the women's restroom and assaulting a cis woman, which, by the way, I could not find any data on. I tried. I believe it is reasonable to conclude that when we're talking about the subject of public restrooms, it is best to divide them by gender identity and not by biological sex, for the safety of everyone involved. Now, I must address the anecdote Zach uses about a trans woman sexually assaulting two women in a women's prison in England.
This pattern continues when males are sent to female prisons. In Wakefield, England in 2017, a male rapist was admitted into a female prison. Why? Because he identified as a woman. While there, he sexually assaulted two female inmates. In 2019, 1 in 50 male prisoners in the UK claimed to be women. What would happen if those male inmates were also sent to female-only prisons?
This is undoubtedly terrible, but the data suggests that sending her to a men's prison would have been even worse for both her and for any other trans woman. Don't believe me? Well, just 10 of the more than 1,000 transgender women in federal prisons are being incarcerated in women's facilities, according to federal data from documentcloud.org. Additionally, a 2020 NBC News investigation found similarly low numbers in state prisons nationwide. As you may expect, this puts transgender prisoners at increased risk of being assaulted and preyed upon. In one federal study, 37% of incarcerated transgender people reported having been sexually assaulted in prison, versus 3% of everyone else behind bars. Transgender people also tell of being forced into sex work, pimped out by fellow prisoners who offer their bodies for money or drugs. I bring this up to illustrate that the problem of trans people being SA'd in prison has actual data to back it up, whereas the sources that Zach uses only have sparse anecdotes. And believe me, I tried to find actual data of trans women assaulting cis women, and I couldn't find any. Despite transgender people being increasingly more visible in prison systems, research suggests that they are at a higher risk of experiencing sexual violence than their cisgender counterparts. Research also suggests that transgender prisoners experience harassment as well as physical and sexual assault by both their fellow inmates and prison officers who lack transgender-specific health knowledge. This is obviously a huge issue because of how the biological sex of trans people can hurt them in the prison system. But this isn't the only source I've found that suggests that when the gender identity of transgender prisoners is not respected, it leads to them being violated. The BOP revealed in recent court documents that 99% of trans women in BOP custody are currently housed in men's facilities. In fact, as of February 20th, the BOP has 2,198 transgender inmates within the federal prison system. Of these people, 22 trans women are currently housed in women's facilities, and one trans man is living in a men's facility. All sexual assault is obviously a problem that needs to be addressed, but my findings indicate that trans women being sexually assaulted in men's prisons is a problem of far greater magnitude than the few cases of which there is no data I could find of trans women assaulting cis women in women's prisons. And yet somehow, the worst part is that fear-mongering and storytelling has been prioritized over the experiences of real victims. Based on this data, I believe that it is reasonable to conclude that in the prison system, people should be separated by gender identity and not biological sex, again, for the purposes of safety. Another topic that I want to cover in slightly less detail is the fighting injustice claim.
Number 8. Fighting injustice. Females across the world are subjected to sex-specific injustices. Practices such as female genital mutilation, FGM, sex-selective abortions, and sex slavery are still common throughout the world. Take female genital mutilation. Concentrated in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, it's estimated that more than 200 million girls and women alive today have experienced FGM. Many countries have rates over 70%.
Most specifically related to female genital mutilation, or FGM, which, according to the World Health Organization, FGM is a practice in many Middle Eastern, Asian, and African cultures that involves removing parts of the clitoris in female children, and it is thought to constrain their sexual desires in these cultures. This is obviously a load of bullshit. It is completely unsupported by research, and it harms children without their consent. I am not necessarily here to argue that FGM isn't bad, because it is, or that sex trafficking also isn't bad, because it is, but rather to argue that the root cause of both of these issues is the patriarchal nature of those societies and of the world at large, which allows powerful cisgender men to get away with horrible crimes like child trafficking and sexual assault unpunished. In order to fight these injustices, we cannot keep relics of the patriarchy around, such as not accepting gender nonconforming people and enforcing strict gender roles. And I would argue that progress towards a true solution lies more in dismantling these systems and building a more egalitarian form of government and public policy, such as those that you see in Scandinavian countries, where the rate of FGM is basically zero, where no one can get away with sexually harassing or grooming anyone, regardless of how much money, power, or influence on the government that they might have. For what it's worth, I actually think that Zach correctly identifies a very prevalent issue across the globe that frankly isn't being talked about enough. but he fails to identify the underlying causes of these problems and thus cannot grasp the correct steps towards a good solution. Now that we're done reviewing the video, I want to talk about exactly why I find Zach and the Paradox Institute to be fueling dangerous anti-trans propaganda, and how this channel represents a larger issue than just one guy using faulty research to reach harmful conclusions. By appearing as a well-researched academic personality on the internet, he is giving them sources to cite when conservative lawmakers pass anti-trans bathroom laws and allow security to dictate who goes where. He is giving them a reason to take away critical life-saving care for trans people. And by the way, multiple studies have shown that lack of gender-affirming care has led to increased suicidality in transgender youth and adults, including one by the Williams Institute at UCLA that reads, "Those who wanted and subsequently received hormone therapy and/or surgical care had a substantially lower prevalence of past-year suicide thoughts and attempts than those who wanted hormone therapy and surgical care and did not receive them." One possible reason that they would not be able to receive this care is because of laws that would be passed that restrict access to gender-affirming care. And I found another study from 2024 that confirms this. It reads, "We found minimal evidence of an anticipatory effect in the time periods leading up to the enactment of the laws. However, starting in the first year after anti-transgender laws were enacted, there were statistically significant increases in rates of past-year suicide attempts among transgender and non-binary people ages 13 to 17 in states that enacted anti-transgender laws, relative to states that did not, and for all transgender and non-binary young people beginning in the second year. Enacting state-level transgender laws increased incidence of past-year suicide attempts among transgender and non-binary people by 7 to 72%. Our findings highlight the need to consider the mental health impact of recent anti-transgender laws and to advance protective policies." So using this data, we can conclude that the ideas presented by Zach and by other conservative content creators at least somewhat influence the political landscape of this country. And whenever these content creators use their voice to promote transphobia, that leads to anti-trans laws. And anti-trans laws lead to people killing themselves. It's devastating, it's sad, and it's why I believe that gender identity needs to be respected regardless of your religious beliefs or not, because it literally leads to people dying. And what's really sad about this is that the government is literally choosing to kill people instead of making the lives of ordinary citizens better. The correlation may be subtle, sure, but as an activist and a content creator myself, it is my duty to provide as accurate of information as possible to my audience, especially if it affects your daily life as well as the lives of people who may be very near and dear to you, and especially in the face of misinformation like we see presented in the Paradox Institute. But I hope that if you take anything away from this video, it is that whenever gender identity is respected, justice and equality can begin to blossom, leading to a better, more egalitarian and fair world for everyone. With that being said, though, that's all I have for you today. So if you enjoyed this video, Please consider leaving a like and subscribing because these videos take a really long time to make, so any support that you can give me is very much appreciated. As always, I hope you guys all have a fantastic day. Peace.